Hey guys, Andrew Ross here again, and we're continuing our talk about the Asheron's Call event, the Shard of the Herald. Now, there were a few players who did know the lore, and may have done the morally right thing when they had the opportunity to do so, but they didn't receive anything more than roleplay opportunities and their name in in-game books. Truthfully though, most people I talk to about the event still don't understand even 10% of the hints we received, both during the event and long after. In fact, they often didn't even know about the other GM events we had at the time, like players being abducted by shadows, which asked them which town they'd like to see destroyed. That's why when I say I want to talk about the actual shard defense today, I don't just mean the people in the trenches, but normal players in their in-game lives at the time. I know that so far it may seem like the events were mostly engaging for power players and lore hounds, but normal players started to get things as well since Turbine started to use more and more visual cues. For example, Narcoman on Reddit remembers being in a group outside of a town near one of the mysterious shadow spires, and that just the movement of the moon gave him this impression that something was about to happen. It didn't, but it just helps illustrate how players were thinking at the time. Then came the November event, Should the Stars Fall, and it set an ominous tone for the coming weeks. Players on the cutting edge of content had to go through a bit of a process to actually access the Shard of the Herald, the last named mob standing between AC players and what seemed like the ultimate evil. Sure enough, the death of the final shard summoned the AC equivalent of Satan, even going so far as to having a Baphomet-like appearance. The shard, which was affectionately known as Harry on Thistledown, was destroyed the very first day of the event on most of the other servers. Again, players have been taught that killing something or doing content led to the equipable rewards, while opting out seemingly meant you lost an opportunity to be a server legend. Although I was on the Thistledown server, people I went to school with were on other servers. And our server seemed kind of weird, especially at first, because not only did we actually defend our shard, but the other servers that also tried to rally a shard defense failed quite quickly. A few knew that someone was taking advantage of a bug, but because of this, all eyes were on Thistledown, and this was because we were potentially taking the game's previously uniform lore hostage, and we sort of threatened to splinter it. And this was exciting, although some people would also become a little annoyed. As you might expect, game stories tend to be developer-driven, and for players, the lore suddenly became very interactive. Several of my classmates suddenly started spending their lunch hour in the computer lab. We had weak internet filters at the time that allowed us access to forums and posts discussing the latest news of the Shard of the Herald defense, and they would use that time to also read up on the game's lore that was finally starting to be disseminated to the rest of us. We'd check in daily with each other to see what was happening, or how past events had actually hinted at what was going on now. But the actual defense didn't really affect the other players on their servers. Thistledown was a little different though. The first thing was that occasionally you'd see a death message that someone had died to Harry, the Shard of the Herald. Player deaths caused a local announcement at their spawn point no matter how far that player had been when they died, and it often came with some fun dialogue. For example, you might have Shadow Child beats Dengar to a bloody pulp, and that meant a Shadow Child mob had killed a player named Dengar with bludgeoning damage. Normally, this served as sort of a warning of potential threats, either highly leveled mobs or in some cases player killers. However, during the event, this is how several of us had found out about one of the defenders' tactics, sacrificing themselves to the shard. Unlike most MMOs, Asheron's Call's creatures could level up by killing players. It was an interesting feature, and as powerful mobs would become more threatening, it required higher level players or additional coordination in order to defeat them. It was also good for a laugh, because bored players might level up a newbie mob like a rabbit or a cow, and then watch that mob just wreck unassuming lobies. However, when it was being used on the Shard of the Herald, it meant that players were giving the Shard a way to defend itself if, for some reason, they weren't able to log in or fight against the oncoming attackers. See, the Shard was in a PvP flagged area. You could only access that area by flagging for PvP, So not only did people trying to destroy the shard have to contend with the shard itself, but their fellow player. So, going back to the death announcement, during the event, certain names would keep coming up when they died, sometimes multiple times within a short duration. These people were usually identified as sharded defenders. However, if it was a group of people who had died, we generally assumed that they had recently tried to attack the shard. Now, naturally on Thistledown, there were a lot of us rooting for the defenders, but on other servers and people at my school were worried that our defense would prevent the developers from giving us our next update. Now, I'm not sure about the attack because I haven't been able to find anyone who was willing to admit that they wanted to attack the shard, but as someone who wanted to help out with the defense, it really wasn't easy. Once regular players figured out who the defenders were, we'd obviously asked to join in. And as there was some cheating going on, few of them would reply to us. Often, actually, these people would just change their spawn locations so they could help level up the shard without the threat of being discovered, not just because of the death message, but to hide their access method to the dungeon. I actually remember finding one such person who was willing to chat for a bit, but they were fairly secretive. All I'd learned was that yes, they were leveling the shard, that certain allegiances were involved, and that few people were invited to directly participate with the defense. Eventually, however, I found out how some of us had been indirectly helping with the defense, including myself. But let's focus on those trench people first. So while some people were sacrificing themselves to the shard, others were literally protecting it. 3 AM raids against the shard were not unheard of. While leveling Harry was a player-created solution, the developers did give the shard's dungeon ways of protecting it. There were other mobs, there were traps and switches, and these could slow the attacker's progress, especially if you were a defender with intimate knowledge of the layout. As the dungeon legitimately required a process to access it without a special cheaty method to return to it, neither side really wanted to leave the dungeon. This is where the rest of the server started to come into play. During the shard defense, I noticed more people with cooks and alchemists. People were asking to buy more consumables than usual. In fact, my brother and I had made a character to cash in on the new market, but we didn't work on it so seriously. My patron, the person who recruited me into the guild, had a friend who had been making some high-level foods, though. It wasn't her main character, and primarily leveled up through the game's experience point pyramid scheme. So while the character was skilled at crafting, it was horribly weak. After she'd tried fighting with it one night and finding out just how weak her character was, she recruited me for a special assignment, pizza delivery. For several days, I'd come to her safe location, and she'd give me more pizzas than any reasonable player would need. And then she'd summon a portal. I go through the portal, run to certain coordinates, trade that pizza for some cash, and it was just out in the middle of nowhere. No one ever offered me a portal back, but my character was rather fast, so I'd just run to the nearest fast travel location and bring the money back to my friend. It didn't seem suspicious, and as I had said, there was this strange market all of a sudden for consumables, so I just thought, oh, this is a way that my friend is helping me get into the money-making process because I couldn't do it myself. However, one day when I was coming back with the money, there was another delivery person, and I knew several of the monarchs or guild leaders who were supporting the defense effort, mostly indirectly, like Ren the Blurry, who was actually friends with Linda Carlson before she worked at Treon. This guy, however, was not only an allegiance that tended to be kind of self-serving unless you were a fellow power player, but they were flagged for PvP. And our own allegiance was inactive in the PvP scene, and we were much smaller and community-based. We really didn't run in the same circles as this guy. So once he left, I'd asked why we were doing business with him. And I was told that our pizzas were being used for the shard defenders. My understanding was that the shard defenders needed to physically be present in the dungeon, obviously. But because that they didn't want to travel back and forth so much, they brought a lot of consumables. This is why the specialty consumables were suddenly in demand. While there were healing kits that could be farmed from the right mobs, specialty food had to be crafted, and the time and effort that went into them was usually not worth it. Players could just use potions, but Asheron's Call's item management system included Burden, meaning that you wanted light, efficient items so that your character could freely move. Heavy objects would prevent this. Normally, even with this system, especially food was too much of a hassle for most people to bother with, but the war effort suddenly created a demand for them, as well as non-PK delivery boys and girls. Not just pizzas and potions, but portals, key fragments, for those not abusing the bug, probably more than I was aware of. In short, much like with World of Warcraft's opening of the Gates of Ahn'Qiraj, it opened new economic markets. What was interesting, though, was that it didn't just affect the game's economy. It also actually helped bolster the RP scene. While I think Frostfell was the unofficial roleplay server, there were some roleplayers on Thistledown as well. In fact, one of the defenders, Blackjack, would write his side of the defense story through a roleplay story that's now preserved on Reddit and other parts of the internet. In-game, the lead-up had done little to inspire roleplay. I remember having story time with one of my first patrons, and the demon in the lightning made things interesting, but updates on the Shard of the Herald brought things to a new level. My patron would sometimes complain that her friends like to sit around and talk a little too often, but during the event, we'd had more and more role players stumble into our little meetings and spice things up. We'd been trading rumors and occasionally digging through in-game notes we'd received from quests to learn about what had been happening, both during the actual defense and before it. Much like with my friends at school, this event made it so that we wanted to learn more about the game world, but being in the game world gave you an opportunity to roleplay what was going on and how your character would react to this situation. In fact, I even remember starting to roleplay a little with a friend from school, and it was something he'd actually never done before. And this, again, wasn't just about understanding the game's lore. The roleplay would bring in new dimensions, like how this affected our character's daily life, how much the game world seemed to overly rely on Asheron to solve our problems, or how other lore figures were appearing to save us. Now, while the event was still a lot of fun for those of us not actually directly helping with the war effort, it really changed things for guild leaders, especially those working directly with the attackers and defenders. Thafherd, one of the more involved Shard defenders who's actually listed on the memorial and a non-player killer, told me via Reddit that his chat interface made it very hard for him to play at times. As the game didn't have guild chat, most people just did private messages, but he also had an announcement system that worked sort of like a text loudspeaker. He mostly remembers a wall of words when it comes to the event, but also he mentioned how people were obviously sleeping less to ensure constant defense, or for attackers, a possible opportunity to avoid that defense. As you all know, though, the Shard fell. The full details are discussed in a developer-written letter to the players, which is linked in the main article on Massively OP that this video can be found in. But essentially, the developers used roleplay to create the finale. Remember, they had had the Gauntlet event, and that helped make sure that there was game lore to help them intervene. Remember, there were 2 players that participated in the Monarch Gauntlet event that showed loyalty to the Hope Slayer, and only one of them answered the call, and her name was Vidorian. The developers used powered-up lore characters to help Vid into the dungeon and slay Harry. This was complicated by several bugs, though, including one where Harry refused commands to scale down, leading to jokes that he'd gained sentience. That is, Harry had reached a very high level in the game, and the game master had tried to de-level him, and he refused. That being said, players also killed the developers and the lore characters as well as Vidorian several times, but somehow Vidorian and the GMs eventually succeeded. The servers would once again have a united storyline, but Thistledown's defense seemed to create a canonical addition to the mostly developer-driven lore, and that, I think, is a big reason why this stood out to players. So, why was this such a big event that still seems poorly understood? First, Turbine tied server first to kills, and these kills gave unique loot drops. This not only promoted the kill option, but also made game lore a commodity. It didn't help that the game was already a niche within a niche genre. That being said, there was an audience for it. Once players better understood it, And once developers gave players a way to change the developer-driven lore, it affected not just basic gameplay, but the social structures and role-play engagement. What I found particularly interesting was that, like full-on PvP games, war was good for the economy, but by limiting it to designated areas, non-player killers could still help with the war effort. Again, Fafhrd was a guild leader involved in the Shard defense, but never flagged for PvP himself. He worked to coordinate his people and other guilds from outside the PvP areas. We're seeing some similar storytelling techniques, such as with Guild Wars 2 and its automated living stories. We also have Elite Dangerous mixing vague clues and ARPG elements with community goals to roll out their storylines, and even pull out some transmedia attempts at a live event. There's certainly an audience for these kind of live events, especially because they're so interactive. However, none yet seem to have as much GM to player interaction as the Shard of the Herald. Others lack the consistently updated storylines. The combination of the two in modern era seems like an ARG, which is why this feels like the genre could benefit from a reintroduction of this kind of event. So, that's our coverage of the Shard of the Herald. Do you think I got that right? Was it interesting? Did you have a different perspective? Feel free to leave comments down below. Thanks for listening. See you guys around.